So hi, everyone. We'll give it to another 30 seconds for people to join the call. Hello to everyone joining. So I think we will kick off. So hello and welcome to this Unmind World Mental Health Day webinar, Controlling the Controllables, How to Cope in a Crisis. So it's a pleasure to have you joining us today in the APAC region. If you would, please just pop in the chat where you're joining from today. I know that Tamara is joining from Sydney, myself and Sophia are joining from the UK. It'd be great to see where you are joining from. So, although the context of today's session is, the multi-crises around the world, we do hope to leave you feeling a little bit more in control of your mental health and well-being, both in work and outside of it, and perhaps a little bit more connected to each other as we recognize our common human experience at a time like this. So before we introduce ourselves, I thought maybe we could just start with a very short gratitude practice. So where you're sitting right now, I'm just going to invite you, if you feel comfortable doing so, just to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths, breathing in, breathing out, and just allow your body and mind to settle. Just feel the contact points of the ground beneath your feet and the chair beneath you if you're sitting down. And just ask yourself right now, what one person in my life am I truly grateful for? What one person just brings joy or value to my life? And allow that person to arise in your mind. Just hold them in your mind as vividly as you can, perhaps even imagining that they're sitting in front of you, and just wish them a silent thank you for all that they bring to your life. And just sit with that feeling of gratitude for them for a few moments. And you can open your eyes if you were closing them. Perhaps even if you want, you can pop down in the chat who you are grateful for right now. So my name's Steve Peralta. I'm the co-founder and Chief Wellbeing Officer at Unmind. And joining me today, we have two brilliant guests, each of whom will bring valuable expertise and perspective to this topic. So first off, I'd like to introduce Tamara Belkin. Tamara is an organizational psychologist for more than 20 years, has been an executive coach for almost 20 years. So really, Tamara brings a wealth of experience to today's conversation. So Tamara, could you tell us a bit more about yourself and your work? You're on mute, Tamara.
Sorry, everybody. Clearly, I'm not an IT specialist. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. My children once said to me, "What do you do? Do you talk to people all day?" And I said, "No, I'm in the business of making people good bosses, because I firmly believe that it's the executive team that sets the tone for the organization, and it's leadership tone for every different aspect of work. And when you have a good boss, you have a fantastic work life." And I'm very rose-colored glasses, and I believe everyone should bounce out of bed excited about their work day. And so whatever I can do to create work environments where people can thrive and minimize the likelihood of feeling unwell and not thriving, then that's what I do. And I do that through individual leadership coaching. So you'll hear more as we go. Yeah.
Thank you, Tamara. There's a lot of resonance between what you do and what we do at Unmind, and we often talk about the whole organization approach, but within that, just recognizing how much of a disproportionately influential role leaders do play. So I definitely agree with what you said there. So also joining us today is my colleague, clinical psychologist at Unmind, Dr. Sophia. Sophia, could you tell our audience a bit more about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Steve. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I work at Unmind in our science team, and we're very broadly responsible for the clinical quality of the platform. Before joining Unmind, I worked in our public health service here in the UK for several years in mental health services, delivering psychological therapies, working with people who were struggling with their mental health, and doing also a lot of work with staff teams in terms of their own well-being and thinking about how staff in the health service took care of their own mental health and well-being.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophia. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Like I mentioned, today we're going to be looking at things through the lens of these multi-crises that are unfolding around us across the world, really. And we're going to be looking at how that is impacting us at an individual level, at a team level within our organizations, and across the whole organization. But we're also importantly going to then look at and recognize those things that we have control over, those things that we can leverage, that we have some agency over to help us cope better during often challenging times. So, the effects of, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the rising cost of, the living crisis around the world, even something like eco-anxiety, these obviously are a confluence of things that we're all experiencing. And we know that this can exacerbate stress and lead to a rise in mental health issues. So the World Health Organization stated that the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a 25% increase in the prevalence of anxiety and depression worldwide. And we know that obviously this may still be the state of affairs given some of the other crises that have followed off the back, which we're only adding fuel to the fire, as it were. So today, with the workplace as our backdrop, we're going to be looking at the right here, the right now, and help us understand what might be happening to us as individuals, as teams, as organizations, like I said, to help to normalize our experience, that we can understand what we're experiencing, but importantly, then take proactive steps to help ourselves and to help others. So at a high level, the lens we'll be looking at through all of this is the I, the we, and the all. So we'll start by looking at the impact that the current climate might be having on us at the I level, us as individuals. So Sophia, I'll start with you. For many of us, change and uncertainty might or will provoke feelings of anxiety. So first off, just for us to all be on the same page, like, what is anxiety?
Yes, sure. So I think, first of all, as you're saying, Steve, just to really normalize that the crises that we're facing at the moment, it's completely normal for us to struggle, to feel stressed, to feel anxious in the face of uncertainty and change. And as humans, we really crave certainty and predictability because in our history as humanity, it's helped us to know that we're going to survive and be okay. And anxiety is a really normal human emotion. We all experience anxiety. It's a bit like our body's alarm bell or trigger. It lets us know that there's something going on that we need to attend to. So if we think about when we were cavemen and we were out in the world and there were animals around us, there was lots of danger. Anxiety really helped us to let us know if there was an animal there that was going to attack us, to either stay and fight. It prepares our body for that, or to run away. So that's kind of state of fight or flight. The issue is that in the modern world, we don't really have, luckily many of us aren't in many situations where we're in a situation of threat. But that system that our body has, that alarm system, is really sensitive, and it's really sensitive because it really wants to protect us. So what happens is it can be activated when there's not a real threat, when there's an imagined threat, or when there's not even a threat, really. And that's what happens. It can get in the way. And there are certain things that we can end up doing that feed into that system and that keep our anxiety going. But it is a completely normal human emotion. We'll all experience anxiety at some points in our lives. But it does go away as well. It's not, it'll come up, it'll be there for a while, and it'll go away at some point as well.
Thank you. So it sounds like, it's a very normal response to some of our universal human needs not being met in the moment, like certainty or like control.
Absolutely.
and that sometimes our response to it can perpetuate the cycle. So I'm sure later on we can maybe look at some of the approach that people can take to maybe help themselves mitigate that cycle or even stop it when it's happening. But look forward to hearing what you say about that later on. Before I hand over to you, Tamar, just one last thing, Sophia. So this anxiety response, like how do you see it affecting us in our lives and in our workplace?
Sure. I think before answering that, one more thing to say.
Yeah.
I think is that I suppose we all have very basic needs that we have in the world to that we need to feel safe in the world. So security, including financial security, having shelter, having enough food, and then when we don't have those basic needs, or when we feel that those basic needs are going to be threatened in some way, then it's again normal to feel stressed and anxious. What was your question, Steve, originally?
The impact that this might be having on people in their personal lives and in their work lives as well.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess generally anxiety can impact our thinking in terms of how we think about our lives and our working lives and personal lives. So it can cause us to have quite negative thoughts about things. It can cause us to predict the worst is going to happen because we're trying to anticipate any threats. And that can mean that it has a real impact in terms of our personal lives and our working lives. It can mean that we might avoid things. We might struggle, I suppose, to put ourselves out there and try new things. But it can also, in terms of our relationships, it can make us more irritable. It can mean that we just have a lower tolerance for extra mental load in a way. It can mean that cognitively we're quite overloaded, and then anything extra feels almost like too much. And in the long term, this kind of stress response can cause a real sense of fatigue. And we noticed, I think, many of us during the pandemic, that kind of constant stress or low-level anxiety that we had. A lot of us were feeling very, very tired after months on end of uncertainty and changing rules and restrictions. So it can have kind of a long-term effect. Of course, stress in the long term can be dangerous in terms of that just kind of chronic stress that we can experience, and eventually it can lead to diagnosed mental health problems for some people.
Thank you, Sophia. So Tamar, like some of the stress and anxiety, and Sophia mentioned cognitive overload, you obviously have good insight into this. What kind of impact can that have on us as individuals, first of all, within the workplace? You're on mute, Tamara.
Yeah, sorry, I'm very worried my puppy is going to do something. She's in the room with me. Look, there are multiple ways that it manifests. Some people actually become more diligent and more conscientious, and they'll overwork. And you know, a lot of people will do that in the pandemic. And there was actually research from the earthquake in Christchurch that was already indicating prior to the pandemic that that's what people were doing, because they had this real sense of, I need to do more and I need to help, I need to put in more effort. The other thing is that people will move against others, so they'll intimidate, they'll be impulsive, they won't help, they won't put in the discretionary effort. And then there are those who withdraw. So then they'll pull away, they won't provide social support, they'll pull out of their social networks. And you know, the professional social networks and having contact with people outside of the family to discuss goals and purposes beyond yourself are one of the psychological benefits of work. And when people start to withdraw from that, it feeds into the cycle. And there's also this sort of, you know, many clients have said to me, I feel so busy, but I'm not accomplishing anything. And there's that whole, the myth of the multitasking. Boundaries disappear. there's anger, there's regret, and there's incivility. People just, to Sophia's point, people just stop being polite. Their fuses are a bit shorter, and it goes to a lot of those little things of, there was no hi, how are you today sort of conversations, and no time for that chatter. And also there's this thing of leisure's a luxury. Lunch is a luxury. And I know they sound really trivial, but the element of what is life and what is work, those boundaries just have got exacerbated when people are feeling under pressure, both with life and with work, as all those elements that you were describing sort of confound onto people. And it's very difficult to accommodate. Yeah. And there's also that sense of, well, I can see that my colleague is struggling, so what will I do to help them? But not necessarily consider, well, what's that impact on my load now? And am I then getting resentful from a third person who's asking me to do something else? And so the underlying conflict starts to build. And then you have the absenteeism, you have mistakes, big mistakes. That fatigue bit, that anxiety, when the cognitive load's up, people are making errors. And then, of course, the flow-on effect from stakeholders of those mistakes, which, causes much discomfort for the workers. So
it sounds like it have kind of like a myriad of effects on us as individuals within organizations. And these effects can certainly make things more difficult in the workplace. I guess the one thing that I can take away from that, it's normalizing this for all of us if we experience this ourselves. It can also invite some sense of understanding and hopefully compassion for others. If we see people acting in certain ways, we can be a little bit more aware of some of the reasons that they might be acting in those ways, given the anxiety-provoking events that we are facing. So it can hopefully invite that as well. But there are ways that we can show up better for ourselves and others, which I'd love us to explore a bit later. But I like us painting this picture quite clearly like you are right now, just so I can really normalize what we're experiencing. One thing I do want to say, so there's some wonderful stuff being shared by our guests at the moment. If any of you have any questions along the way, please feel free to pop them into, you'll see the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. And I'll do my best to come to those questions towards the end. So please, if you have any questions you'd like to ask our wonderful guests, please just pop them into the Q&A box. So Tamara, I'll stay with you. So all those things that you've been describing, and I guess you touched on some of it. How would that, or how do you see that manifesting at a team level? Are there any obvious dysfunctions that start to happen within a team that you could speak to?
Yeah, look, there's an increase in conflict, there's a decrease in collaboration, the creativity goes down. People aren't, they're not making that effort to form relationships within their team because it's an extra thing. And everybody who's worked in an organization knows that you need to get to know people, and you need to know, you can't just ask somebody to produce a report for you in the next 20 minutes if you've got no relationship with them and you only call them for a favor. And so all that type of behavior just falls by the wayside. The other thing is, when you're in this crisis mode within a business, there's sort of this, not quite forgetful, but the hamster wheel's spinning, and so the strategic stuff isn't happening. So it's how we're putting out all these fires now, but not how we're going upstream to think about why this occurred, what can we do to mitigate it going forward, and also to sort of, then there's customer service failures, because you can't provide top-notch customer service when you're not performing at your best. And so the flow and effect isn't just to your team, it's to other teams within the business, and it starts to undermine the customer experience, and then that will have flow and effects to, well, hang on, your team's not bringing in the revenue, there's words are coming from above and alongside, and there's turnover. People will leave. They'll be like, this isn't, this isn't the team I joined. I don't feel like we're doing what we meant to. Nobody's being kind. I'm not going to pull my weight. And so suddenly, that whole thing of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts doesn't apply anymore. Yeah. And all the beauty of what comes from people working together the serendipitous conversations, the problem solving, it just sort of, disappears, which is unpleasant, really, and unfortunate.
When you say that the serendipity of people working together, I think that working together thing is really powerful as well, because I know that during challenging times, the research shows that when you are able to recognize your common challenges and actually work well together, you actually strengthen your bonds as people within teams. Like there is opportunity within challenging times as well, which I think is so important. And I'd love to maybe look at that as well. And you also mentioned the word, I can't remember the exact context, you mentioned the word kind there. And I think kindness for ourselves and others at a time like this is also really important. And maybe we can expand that in a bit. But Sophia, so tomorrow mentioned some of the impact that this might be having on teams, the situation we'll have on teams at the moment. And we know that managers play such a critical role in the well-being of their teams and obviously the performance of the teams. But we also know that the situation right now and the way that things have been over the past few years and work going hybrid and the like has made the role of a manager even more difficult than it has been prior to now. So before we start to look at some of the ways that we can help managers, how do you feel managers are feeling right now? What is their experience like right now?
I think managers are usually in an organization, have a lot of responsibility for obviously for the people. They're the direct line of communication with their people, and often there can be, I guess, a lot of responsibility put on managers to manage that. I suppose at the moment, in terms of lots of change, lots of uncertainty going around. People, workers will be feeling that and will be bringing that to work, will be bringing worries to work and anxieties to work. And to some degree, a manager's job, of course, within limits, is to offer some containment to that anxiety. So really listen to know their worker, listen to them, know their personal circumstances, and offer some degree of support, I suppose, in terms of what's within their circle of influence. But of course, managers will also be facing all of these wider issues in terms of the financial crisis, in terms of war, social unrest, everything we're seeing at the moment. So they'll have their own issues as well that they'll have to also contain for themselves. And I think there's a tricky balance there between sharing enough of yourself and sharing your humanity with the people that you manage, but in a way that feels, again, I keep saying this word containment, that feels doesn't feel out of control, feels contained, and so that the other person feels safe as well. So sharing some of yourself in a way that feels human, but just enough so that the people that you work with feel that they know you and they see some vulnerability, but that they can trust that you can support them through this crisis as well. So it's a tricky balance to hold, and I think we can only do that when we know ourselves, and when we know our kind of boundaries, and what we feel able to share and not share.
Thank you, Sophia. So Tamara, a lot of what Sophia's just said there will apply to senior leaders within an organization as well. But I'd love to hear, especially based on what you mentioned at the very beginning of this session, how might this be affecting senior leaders, the executives within organizations, and also how might their way of showing up unknowingly be throwing, let's say, fuel onto the fire, as it were, when people are already feeling anxious and uncertain? What is this experience like for a leader right now?
I always feel that the poor leader is the meat in the sandwich. And I think that it's at any level within the organization, because there's always the expectation by whomever is reporting to them that they can control everything. And then there's the expectation by those above that they can get all these magical things done. And, then let's throw in the stakeholders, and suddenly these individuals are expected to achieve the unachievable by the nature of their role, and then let's throw in all this other stuff, and they're meant to show up at work with high levels of self-awareness, demonstrate in a non-judgmental approach to the way they have conversations with their staff, have high emotional intelligence, and almost be vulnerable, but not too vulnerable. There's a little bit of literature on what they share, and that it can actually be intimidating for the direct reports if they get it wrong. And then also, I had a client say to me recently, Tamar, I don't have time to get my work done. I am setting boundaries with how much I'm letting my staff tell me, and I know my role is not their psychologist, etc. But on the other hand, there is so much that is happening that I don't want to be working till midnight. But on the other hand, I don't want to, close the door and not have a moment for my staff, my colleagues, for my clients, for my boss. And so, I think that when I work with a senior executive team, they need the space for themselves to come to terms with the changes before they can then sell it, manage those below, and then also decide, what are the elephants in the room that we're going to talk about? What are the things that we can and can't push back upon? And they do have a high level of pressure and responsibility. And I guess those, as you use that word kind, a kind leader really, they care deeply about their employees, which can be an extra burden upon them. It's an asset and a liability, I suppose, but it's something you don't want them to lose their humanity or to burn out, and to notice, and that's a scary thing that's going on. So, yeah.
So you say there, like, we don't want leaders to lose their humanity. Like, a line that I often use is show up as a human first and leader second. However, you also said, you spoke about some research about not being too vulnerable as a leader. If you don't mind, I'd love you just to tell us a little bit more about that. Like, what is the sweet spot then? I mean, I'm sure it's different for all of us, different depending on the people you're interacting with, but what is that sweet spot? What is too vulnerable?
It is different for everybody, and I guess it's this cognizance around the power dynamic. And I think that it's, in workplaces today where we have these matrices and the hierarchy isn't as rigid, there's sometimes this disconnect around, well, do I really have more power of some sort because I am the boss? And I think that that's where the caution is. I also think that I know this professionally, and I'm sure that Sophia would agree, is that you can be very non-judgmental, you can be very empathetic, and you can just listen, very active listening, with curiosity and without judgment, and learn a lot about another person without sharing very much of yourself.
Yeah.
And so they, because sometimes someone can feel that their experience is minimized when another person goes, oh yeah, my child vomited all over my laptop this morning, and or whatever, or yes, I stuffed up the figures that I presented to the board. Well, you tell that to your direct report, and they might go, golly, does that mean my job's on the line now? Because and feed into what Sophia was talking about, anxiety, it can, and people feeling high levels of uncertainty, that can go very awry. So it's a real judgment call, and I suppose, and I don't know if it always sounds very simple, but the stronger the relationship you have with your employees, the better you know them, the better you understand what drives and motivates them, the easier it is to have those conversations. And I know I fumble a bit when I speak, right? I pause, I'm never sure of the right word. And in a conversation with another person, it enables them to realize you haven't quite got it, or you may be understanding their predicament incorrectly. And so as you have that relationship with your staff, the leader can start to get a sense of, well, what should I share? When should I share? Can I give them time to absorb what I've shared and still be with them for the fallout? So that it's, I know you always want a bit of a rule of thumb, and us psychologists never have them, do we, Sophia? sort of sit on the fence. But I have some resources that I can definitely give to Abby to share with the group afterwards, with some articles that I found a couple of weeks ago on that very topic.
I think that's really helpful. I think there's a lot of nuggets of wisdom and insight there for leaders and for managers. So any on the call, I think that's really important stuff that Tamara's just said. And just a reminder, I see some questions coming through. So if you do have any questions for Tamara or Sophia, please do pop them in the Q&A box and we'll come back to them. So I guess we've contextualized things. Well, you have both contextualized things really well here. We've got a really good understanding of the impact that the world right now is having on people within the workplace and outside of the workplace. You know, it's normal to experience feelings of anxiety. We've looked at some of the knock-on effects that this can have on our well-being, on our work, on our relationships with people at work as well, across the organization. And the thing is, like, some of our ways of responding to the situation, as understandable as they are, they can unintentionally make things worse for ourselves and others. That's also important to recognize. So it'll be good now to look at some of the things that we do have some control over, things that we can practically do and have some agency over, to, like I said earlier, maybe throw water on the fire instead of fuel, which takes us to this key part of our conversation today, which is controlling the controllables. So I guess we're going to be looking at the controllables part. So Sophia, on an individual level, what are some of the things that people can do to help them overcome feelings of worry and cope better with feelings of anxiety at a time like this?
So I think, I suppose I see this in terms of, I guess, three parts, really. I think the first is really understanding. So understanding ourselves and the personal reactions that we'll have in face of uncertainty and change. Really understanding what sorts of emotions come up for us, what our stress reactions look like, whether we feel that in our body, whether we notice we're having specific thoughts, doing specific things, withdrawing, having an extra glass of wine, whatever that is for us. We'll all have our own individual stress response, and really growing our awareness of how we respond in the face of stressful situations. So that's the first bit, I suppose. The second bit, I would say, is to really, once we have an understanding, having, I guess, an idea of the things that we can address, but also a sense of what we can't change. And with that, I think, comes some degree of acceptance that's needed in terms of the current situation that we're facing, that we may have little power over. And I think that can be quite painful and scary. I think some of us might have been lucky and have led generally predictable and safe lives. And it can be, I guess, a scary realization when we're facing a kind of global crisis of our vulnerability in the world. But I think even if we don't have, I suppose, full control or predictability, we all need some predictability and sense of control to feel okay. So there's a level of acceptance, I think, that's needed of, okay, this is the situation. I understand how I'm feeling because of this situation. Some stuff here is beyond me. I don't have any influence over, and I'm gonna work on not being okay with it, because we're talking about social injustice, we're talking about war, political violence, but some degree of acceptance for us to feel okay in our daily lives. And then, I guess, beyond that acceptance, then we can focus on the things that we can change for ourselves, so that are within our circle of influence. So things that we can do to help ourselves to cope and to manage. And I guess here we would talk about, first of all, I guess kind of more problem-focused things. So, in terms of our finances, seeking financial advice or support. If we're facing a difficulty at work, if there's change at work, then speaking to our manager or a colleague or HR. So doing things that are within our sphere of control. And then there are also, I guess, things that we can do within our control to manage those difficult emotions, to nurture ourselves so we can feel better emotionally. So things like breathing in the moment can be really helpful for that. I was speaking earlier about that anxiety response that our body goes into, the fight or flight, where we might start sweating, we feel hot, our breath kind of becomes very quick and shallow. And deep breathing, slowing down our breath can really help us in the moment, in those moments of intense stress. So practicing breathing exercises, mindfulness as well can be helpful to really focus ourselves in the present, so that we're not dwelling on the past or catastrophizing, jumping to the future, helping us to have a little bit more distance from our thoughts. And I think, in terms of practical things as well, disconnecting from the news. There's so much going on at the moment. Just being mindful of that, of our boundaries and how we consume media and news. It's just it's not natural to be constantly updated and constantly seeing distress around us. So just being mindful of that and introducing some boundaries. And I think as well, I think it's important in times like these of change and uncertainty to connect with our sources of strength, whatever they may be, whether that's relationships with family or friends or particular things in our lives that give us a sense of achievement and purpose. It's really helpful to, I guess, hone in on those. And also to be aware of our own values and what's important to us, because I think that really helps us to know what to prioritize for ourselves and what we need to be selfish about to protect ourselves and to stay well.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Sophia. There's a whole host of wonderful heuristics and strategies that people can employ. I think that, I'm sure many of you have heard of this, that serenity prayer really captures this, what you just described now, quite succinctly. I'm going to read it quickly. I know it's evolved over the years, but it's effectively, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I love that. And so, yeah, I urge people to check that one out. So tomorrow, Sophie has shared a bunch of wonderful strategies that people can use to help them cope with feelings of anxiety, to recognize what they can control, what they can't control. Do you have any other proactive strategies that you could share, particularly to not only help us cope, but perhaps even build positive mental health and well-being at a time like this?
As Sophia was talking, I was thinking it's very delightful to be able to be in a forum like this with a complementary colleague, because, the clinical and the org, we look at the person from different angles. And so, at work, the role of purpose is often sort of, this thing on the web page, what is the purpose of the organization, but actually for the individual employee, to stop and think about, well, who benefits from what I am doing? Who am I serving? Why am I here? And how am I going to remind myself of that? I've got clients who actually have little pictures on post-it notes on their laptops to say, hang on, this is why I'm doing this. And this is who I'm serving. And irrespective of everything going around, for some of my day, I'm going to find some flow. I'm going to cut off all my distractions. And I'm really going to focus on how is what I'm doing in this moment helping those or that particular individual or those individuals. And while it can't be done all day, every day, the more it can, the better it is. And it applies to every industry. I had somebody in superannuation, we often think of the finance sector as, they're all a bit. And they said to me, Tamar, people work really hard and I want to make sure that they have the retirement that they deserve. And that's what I focus on. And I picture the faces of my clients when I do all my work. And I think for everybody to consider what that is for themselves, not for others, and to get their colleagues to do it. It's also another way of sharing and being vulnerable on a positive level. And it sort of starts to have that beautiful contagion effect of the positive emotions being contagious. The values piece, which Sophia alluded to, is critical, and it ties into ethics, because people need to think about, well, what are their ethics? Because there's grey all the time at work, and it adds to the discomfort and the comfort. And the values help us decide on boundaries and prioritization. I often teach my clients to be politely assertive. Plan to be politely assertive. Plan to know when you actually can push back on something, or you can request to push back on something, because the urgency is possibly from the anxiety of the boss or the customer, not necessarily because strategically it has to happen in that time frame. I talk about well-being not negotiables. And so when Sophia was alluding to some of the strategies you have for yourself in terms of managing anxiety, it's thinking about that whole piece around with your relationships, with the meaning and purpose that you have, with your boundaries, with your resilience, with your physical health and well-being, and with your flow. Well, what across all of that is not negotiable? I have a client, it sounds really wacky, but they will always eat an orange, and they will always walk out of their office and they will eat their orange. And while it seems completely ridiculous, because, it's not going to change the world, they will never give that up. And it doesn't matter how hectic their life will be. I think that in the, work is often thought of as this discrete entity, but there's a lot of literature around what you do outside of the workplace in your leisure and your creativity fuels that creative spirit back into the workplace. And I think that, an aspect of well-being, and, Sophia's talking about let's not watch the news. Well, my first thought is, no, let's actually go and find some leisure. Leisure is like, it feeds the soul. It's what we love doing. And to have a hook, to have an accountability piece with that leisure. Maybe you've got to tell your mate about the chapter that you read in your novel, or, you've got to cut a flower from the walk you went on. It doesn't have to be huge or onerous, but to know for yourself, what is it that you build in. And I think the other thing is around savoring positive moments. We often complete a project and we're on to the next one because, the due date's already passed and there's all this thing, and there's no moment of pause and go, wow, how do I feel? We obviously, as Sophia said, have to come to terms with these strong negative emotions and be comfortable with them, but let's not do that at the expense of the positive ones. And if we want to brag to our friends and family, because we won't find ourselves feeling arrogant in that context, but to relive that experience starts to feed in Barbara Fredrickson broaden and build model of positive emotions. It just starts to allow that positive spiral to just flit into our lives in a nice way. And so
I love that.
Yes, it's like there's
I love
lots
that.
more.
It sounds like you're talking about having some agency over doing things that enrich our spirits as human beings. That might look different from person to person. One person who might be eating an orange. No, I love that. I love that example. I love the idea of non-negotiables, but perhaps it's an invitation for us to think, what are our non-negotiables when it comes to feeling like filling our cup, as it were, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. So I really love that. So that speaks to personal agency, which is so important. To me, it's like one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is the environment that we exist in. We know that our mental health and well-being doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are social determinants of it as well, the environment, the culture, the society, etc. And so obviously that speaks about the society outside of the workplace, which is maybe not a topic for this conversation, but our societies or our cultures within the workplace are within, to different degrees, our controls, whether you are an employee or a manager or a leader. So the final question before we move on to some of the questions that our guests have sent through, our attendees, is what are some ideas you have for how we can, whether you are an employee or a manager or a leader, you can maybe speak to those different roles if you like, how can we create a culture in the workplace that actually meets the needs that we have as human beings, like belonging and connection and self-esteem and safety and security, how can we create that kind of culture that actually fosters flourishing in the workplace? Because I think for too long we've just associated the workplace with it just comes, it's part and parcel with the stress, but it actually has all the ingredients to fulfill human beings and actually create well-being. So I'd love to hear from both of you your thoughts on that. How can we create cultures of well-being within the workplace? And we'll start with you, Sophia.
Yes, so I think that's a really huge question, and I really welcome Tamar's thoughts. I think you'll have loads of thoughts. I suppose for me the main thing is everyone being aligned on what we mean, what our workplace culture is, what the whole organization wants together, and some of that coming from bottom up as well as top down. So really working together to agree a shared understanding of, okay, what are we doing here? What are our priorities? What are our values? I'd say that's the kind of really important at a foundation, and then thinking about how that's implemented. And making, I guess, having commitment from leadership, buy-in from all levels of the organization, and I guess a commitment to continually work on that and continually to feed that, because these things aren't static. It's something that we're constantly working on and developing and growing.
Thank you, Sophia. Tamar, I'm sure you have some stuff to add as well.
Look, I ultimately, and there's lots of resources and around Australian resources and international resources around, well, how do you create a psychologically safe and healthy workplace? Are people in the right jobs? Is the work psychologically damaging, et cetera, et cetera? And that's, I would say a lot of the people on this call are aware of that stuff. What I think is also really appropriate, really important to do is to go upstream. We very rarely sort of go and say, well, what caused this to happen? Why is this going on? Instead of fighting the fire, well, this is a bit of an Australian thing. Let's do some back burning. Let's make sure that we have, that we don't have fuel to be burnt, so to speak. And how do we put some things preventively? But I think also in the current context, it's incumbent on the leader to pull the team together and name the elephant in the room, to say, guess what, guys, this is what's happened. We've just, due to the economic situation, we've just lost this major deal and we have to pivot this organization. And no, none of us like it. And it's going to mean that 50% of our jobs are really boring. And just, throw it out there and then say to the group, how are we going to manage this? We still want to be, as you said, Steve, we want to be engaged. We want to love what we do at work. We want a great social environment. We want to be kind to each other. We want it to be fun. But, this is the elephant in the room. What are we going to do? And how are we going to keep each other accountable? And also maybe there is somebody who loves that bit the rest of us find boring. Let's not overburden them, because it may be fun if they're only doing it 3 days a week. It may not be, and to have that and to also regroup and it's a safe to fail, run it as a safe to fail experiment, see how it pans out, come back with the group and say, well, how did that go? To not assume that things are going to continue. And I think that the other thing around communication and elephants in the room is the idea that even if you don't know what's going to happen, to just say that. The number of executives will say to me, Tamar, I don't know how to tell them that I don't know what's going to happen. Well, just tell them, because that's being very trustworthy. But also to have some rules as a team. We are not sending emails on the weekend. If you've got a great idea, sure, type the email, save it in your draft. We're going to be loud and proud as a leader of what we're doing, because yes, walk the walk, talk the talk, whatever it is, but it's much better to say, cheerio guys, I'm out in the sun and I'm going to have my sandwich under a tree. I'm having lunch. I know I sound like everyone's mum, but just the little things, but to not be scurrying off with what you're doing in terms of well-being, or you know, some things around. I had a client once, they decided they were calling it the hour of power. And it was an hour where there was no emails, no messages, and everybody was getting tasks done. Because anyone who's worked with an Excel spreadsheet, well, you can't be doing the complicated stuff while you're being interrupted. You know, so to have this sort of common language as a team to discuss these things, and then for the leader to think about, well, am I putting up an umbrella around my team? Am I pushing back? Is that pushback actually going to go all the way up to the board? Because are we going to somehow send the message of, well, if you want me to do X, then what do you want me to drop? Because we have limited capacity. And, you know, the demands resources thing, we can't just keep acquiring resources. You know, our cup, as you said, is only so full. And so, you know, it's conversations around that. And also, I guess, around the things to ensure that the leadership team isn't forgotten, because they need a place as the rapid change comes along to come to terms with it so that they can then support others. And I guess also reducing the stigma around mental health in the workplace. I mean, you know, that's what this whole week is about. But ideally, we want it to be like diabetes, you know, where, oh, you're diabetic. Okay. All right. Let me know, you know, when you need help and what your warning signs will be. End of story, you know, and that meant, you know, what do you need for your care? And off we go, right? You know, let's work on this task together. And, you know, that's my rose-colored glasses. The stigma of mental health is just, you know, it's just like, I need my glasses to read. It's just, you know, like a sort of simple thing like that. So, yeah, that sort of organizational-wide cultural things to start to shift.
I mean, you mentioned rose-colored glasses, and I mean, what you've described there, it's not toxic positivity, it's being open and authentic about the challenges, and then having hope and optimism as well. It's not a either or, it's a both and. And you spoke about the importance of role modeling as a leader and about prioritizing well-being, having open conversations, all really, really important stuff. So thank you both. I want to move on to we've got 3 questions here from the audience. And Sophia, I'll start with the first one here for yourself. So sometimes we tend to focus on negative thoughts, which creates and fuels anxiety. What is your advice to control our thoughts and reduce anxiety?
Okay, that's a good question. I think oftentimes we can be ruled by our thoughts, and it's important to, I guess, remember that our thoughts are just thoughts. They're not facts. So they might seem like facts and they might seem like reality, but they are just thoughts. And it's true that when we're feeling anxious, when we're feeling low, we can have the tendency to have negative thoughts that don't quite reflect the reality of the situation that we're facing. We might think that the worst is going to happen or jump to conclusions. I'd say the first thing to do is to try to gain, and this is again something to learn and to practice, to gain some distance from our thoughts. So we call this thought diffusion in kind of psychology language, which is introducing a little bit of distance from our thoughts. And what that does is once we have a little bit of distance from our thoughts, then we have more options. We can choose what we do. So to do that, we might just simply name, I'm having this thought. Already just naming that disconnects us a little bit from the thought. We're noticing that we're having the thought rather than being lost in the thought. And that takes practice. Another, I guess, way of really becoming more aware of our thoughts, and again, gaining that distance and learning how to do that is mindfulness practice. It's a really good way of noticing the patterns that we can get into in our head in terms of our thoughts and gaining a little bit of distance from that. And then once we've gained that little bit of distance, then we have options. So we can think about I guess asking ourselves some questions of whether, is this thought useful to me right now? Does this thought reflect the actual situation? what would I say to a friend in that situation? There's lots of questions that we can ask ourselves to help us to kind of reevaluate our thoughts and come to, I guess, a more maybe realistic view of whatever situation that we might be facing. So it takes practice, I think. And sometimes even people like to have kind of stock phrases written down somewhere on their phone or on a little piece of paper that they can come back to help with that, because it is something that takes practice.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sophia. Some really, really helpful insights and strategies there. So Tamar, I'm going to hand you the next question. So the question here is, now that we have returned to the office, I find it hard to tune out after working hours. I find myself regularly checking emails and having the need to respond promptly to emails. I'm sure many people can relate. How do I deal with this? So do you have any thoughts to share on that?
So it's really interesting, because I reckon in most parts of the world, we have these long, onerous commutes and we can just hate them or love them. And I think the commute is potentially a gift, because there's a concept called the third space. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but basically the first space is where you are, the second is a sort of relaxation point, and then the third space is where you're headed to. And so it's sort of a way of closing off your life before you leave work. So if you have to, catch that train at a minute past the hour and you finish your last bit of work at 3 minutes before the hour and you sprint to the station, then you do your third space on the train. And you literally take some time to write down the to-do list, everything that's top of mind that you need to do. And it could be buying milk, it could be replying to the email to the CEO, it doesn't matter what it is. Dump it all down, and guess what? It's on a note, it's on your phone, it's there. And then do a relaxation activity, similar to the one Steve did at the beginning. That was, I didn't time it, but it was pretty short, and it grounded all of us. It was a really delightful thing to do. And then it's time for leisure. You're on the train and you can do some leisure. You can read a book, you can call a friend, you can listen to something interesting, but you close off work. Not allowed to do work. It's not time for work. And then before you get home, you have your preparation for the next space. Where are you headed? Who are you walking in the door to? Will you smell dinner? Will you need to cook dinner? Will you just want to wash your hands and look at your front door? Whatever it may be, what's your strategy for that? And you've sort of created this bubble of refreshment. When it comes to what are you going to do with the emails? I watched a manager once delete the email app from his staff member's phone. He literally deleted it and said, you will never respond to an email when you are not in the office. Now, it takes a really brave boss to do that, but you may decide that the notifications are off, that app moves to the third screen where there's all that stuff you forgot you've even downloaded on your phone, and you don't look at it, or you give yourself a set period of time. You think about the boundaries and know yourself, know what accountability you need to bring in, who's going to keep you honest, who's going to make sure you actually do it. But don't also, Sophia would know this better than me, change takes time. So if you slip up one week, don't worry about it. You're cycling forward with the change, and it's going to be something that you do gradually.
Thank you so much, Tamar. So thank you for everyone's questions coming through. Unfortunately, we have 1 minute left, and in respect of everyone's time, I'm going to have to wrap things up. So just very briefly, Tamar, thank you so much. You brought such a valuable and relevant lens to this conversation today. Can you quickly tell us where people can find you, and just share one pithy final invitation for people before you go?
So I have a really complicated business name. It's called Balkan Coaching. So it's just my surname. And I'm a .com.au. So it's balkancoaching.com.au. My one little thing is pick one thing. Don't pick 55 to do differently. And you'll never go wrong if you're kind.
Love it. Thank you so much. And Sophia, again, thank you so much. I love the way you, like Tamar mentioned earlier, you've complemented each other based on your respective expertise. What is maybe one or two unmind bits of content that you'd recommend for users that are on the call, and then also your one final takeaway.
Absolutely. Bits of content in terms of our longer series that are more educational programs. We have one about coping in hard times, which I think is really relevant to what we've been discussing today. Maybe not to everyone, but I think people will find useful things in there. We've spoken a lot as well about mindfulness and breathing exercises to help with in the moment stress and anxiety responses. And there are loads of mindfulness and breathing exercises on the platform and in the calm category and also in the mindfulness category. So I'd really encourage everyone to explore that. And in terms of one final thought, I think we've spoken about this today, but maybe not named it, but I think compassion is really central to everything that we've been discussing today. So an openness to others and how they're feeling, an openness to suffering, and a commitment to alleviate that suffering, to do something about it, whether that's for ourselves or for others.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, Tamar. I've really enjoyed listening to you today. I'm sure everyone else has as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call, and I wish you all a good rest of your evening, and if it happens to be the rest of your day, like Sophia and I, the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.